Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Cameron Hopkinson, a freelance game accessibility consultant, and today I'm going to be doing a fairly deep dive into text and how you can make your in-game text more accessible. Now, I'm going to be trying to cram a lot of stuff into 15 minutes, so I'm going to go through things quite quickly, but I will have summary slides every now and then to help reinforce things, and I will be around afterwards for questions if anyone has them. Probably not going to be in the talk slot, but that's okay. So before I start, here is a bit of mock quest dialogue that I wrote. It is someone handing out a quest to a player. Now, have a look at this and see if you can figure out what the quest being given out is. So, as you can see or possibly not see, there's just a few small issues here. And we're going to go through, well, there's a lot of issues, but a couple of really obvious ones. We're going to go through these and address them one by one and, just have this be actually readable. Let's start with a couple of the most obvious issues first. Text size. That text is far too small. Text size, according to the Game Accessibility Guidelines, is one of the most frequently complained about accessibility issues in games, along with bad subtitles, unrebindable controls, and issues with color blindness. Very small text it's an issue that especially affects lower vision players, players with cognitive disabilities like dyslexia that affect their ability to read text, and players who are playing on a small TV from a couch on the other side of the room. The Game Accessibility Guidelines recommend using a minimum text size of 28px at 1080p. You can use PT too. The only real difference is PT is slightly bigger, but they scale at the same rate. Now, I would recommend using this minimum of 28px on both console and PC. Some accessibility guidelines, like the Microsoft ones, suggest that you can use smaller text on PC, but I would argue against this because some people, like me, use TVs as their PC monitors, and when I'm PC gaming from the couch, I would like to be able to read your text. Now, this 28px is a minimum. Ideally, you'd be able to set it to be bigger. A good target for this is double that, so 56px at 1080p, but I'll talk a bit more about scaling later. This is what 28px text looks like at 1080p. I put it over some public domain photography, so it feels nice in AAA. This is the minimum that you should be aiming for. So one thing to know about text size is that you're going to need to scale it with resolution. 28px is fine at 1080p, but at 4K it is far too small. 4K is twice as big vertically and horizontally than 1080p, so you'll want to double that. Your new minimum is 56px, and you should let players scale to at least 112px. This is what 56px looks like at 4K resolution. Through the magic of maths, this should look roughly the same as 28px at 1080p. So if you're developing for mobile, one of the disadvantages of working in that area is that mobile devices can vary in the amount of dots per inch that their screen support, and you're going to need to scale your text according to that. Now, I haven't done too much work with mobile, but Microsoft recommends using the following font sizes for different DPIs: 18px at 100 dpi, 36px at 200 dpi, and 72px at 400 dpi, otherwise scaling linearly from there. So, as I mentioned earlier, your minimum should be 28px at 1080p, and you should support letting players scale to twice that. Large font size are better suited as an option rather than a default, and this is because for players that don't need large text, it can take up too much of the screen and just feel obtrusive to a lot of players. So it's good to let players opt into that. One thing to keep in mind with that, though, is that when letting players set accessibility settings on first starting up the game, you'll want the text there to be the bigger size, and that is so players that do need that bigger text can read the instructions on how to opt into that bigger text. Another couple of things to keep in mind with text scaling is that to be sure to test your UI and stuff with the biggest text size that you are aiming to support. Issues with subtitles that overflow off screen, UI that breaks, stuff like that. It does happen, and it does make it to commercial releases. I have seen it multiple times. So to avoid any launch day surprises, it is best to test your UI with text scaling to the biggest that you're supporting with the most text that you're planning to support to avoid issues like this. So if you're using an existing font, it is really easy to see what your font size is. You just look in the little box that has a little number and it tells you. But if you're using something bespoke and you need to calculate it yourself, here is a quick overview on how you can calculate the px value of your font. Your font size is the number of pixels between the lowest point of any letter and the highest point of any letter in your font. Some letters have what are known as ascenders and descenders, which are parts of the letter that go above and below the usual boundaries of a letter. To give an example of what I'm talking about, this G in legit, you see how that tail goes below all the other letters? That tail is a descender, and that is included in your font size calculation. Now, the good news is this calculation is really easy to do. Just open it up, take a screenshot, open up that screenshot in any image editor, Microsoft Paint. It really doesn't matter, you're not doing anything complicated. Then draw a box around it, touching the edges of the text, and see how big that box is. That is your font size. Now, there are edge cases such as if your text is multiple colors and it blends a bit into the background. But this is the usual case, and a more detailed set of instructions can be. Microsoft, in particular, in their Xbox Accessibility Guidelines, has a really good write-up on how to do this. That has a bit more detail. But 50 minutes, so we're just going to continue on. So to summarize for font size, aim to have a minimum of 28px at 1080p and 56px at 4K. On mobile, aim to account for different DPIs. Some engines do this automatically, but something to keep in mind. Aim for 18px at 100 DPI, 36px at 200 DPI, and 72px at 400 DPI. And let players scale to double the suggested minimum text sizes that I've just mentioned. And for calculating font size, it is the number of pixels between the lowest point of any letter and the highest point of any letter in your font. So having addressed text size, let's look at that quest dialog again. This is still unreadable. The big issue now is that the text and the background are pretty much the same color. So let's talk about contrast. Contrast in text is how different the colors are between text and background. Much like text size, it especially affects low vision players, players that have disabilities like dyslexia, but it's also an issue for players that are colorblind. When there is high contrast between text and the background, it is much easier to read. This high contrast black and white text, that is really easy to read. That green text on a green background is less easy to read. One of the main tools that we can use to determine how much contrast there is between text and the background is a contrast ratio, which is a value that we can derive from the brightness values of both the foreground and background colors. The higher the contrast ratio, the more different the two colors are. If two colors have the same brightness, there's a contrast ratio of 1. This usually happens when text and background are the same color, such as this red text on a red background. I know you can't see it, but I promise you it's there. Now, if we compare two very different colors, such as black and white, those have a contrast ratio of 21:1. Generally, you will want to have a contrast ratio of at least 4.5. Here are a few examples of what that looks like. Now, figuring out how to calculate contrast ratios involves some maths, and it's not exactly trivial maths. And I'll break some of this down shortly, but for those of you who look at this and can feel a little bit of panic rising, I have some good news for you. There is a lot of free contrast calculators on the web. You just have to Google contrast calculator and you will find one. You plug your color values into this and it will spit out a contrast ratio. If you don't have your actual RGB values, then you can just take a screenshot of the text, use the color picker in any image processing software to just get the RGB values and plug them into there. So for a basic summary of color contrasts, aim to have your text and backgrounds have a contrast ratio of at least 4.5, and there are a lot of free tools that you can use to check your contrast ratios. To dive a bit deeper into how contrast is calculated, I'm going to talk a bit about pixel luminance. You probably don't need to know this, but it's useful background context to have. The calculation doesn't use red, green, or blue values directly. It is calculated using the brightness of a pixel, and the brightness value is pixel luminance, which is a weighted average of the red, green, and blue values that attempts to account for how our eyes see colour. The average human eye perceives green as brighter than red and red as brighter than blue. So green contributes the most to pixel luminance and blue contributes the least. If you have an image editor open and you turn a colour image into grayscale, pixel luminance is the value that is used to do this, as you can see with the colours up there. Now, one of the main benefits of using a measure of brightness rather than colours directly is that it helps address colour blindness. Here is some really ugly red text on a green background. This red and green have a contrast ratio of 1, meaning they are the exact same brightness. This is essentially that red text on red background that I showed you earlier. And most of you will be able to read this fine, but there is a small proportion that won't be able to because of colour blindness. If we apply a filter to simulate colour blindness, the problem becomes really obvious. This is unreadable, even with the large text size. If you're curious, this is a filter that simulates protanopia, which is the absence of red cones in a person's eyes, so it's just green and blue. Making sure your text and backgrounds have a colour contrast ratio of at least 4.5 will help avoid situations like this. Now, you're not always going to know what colour your text is going to be on, especially if you have text that is displayed during gameplay. So if you have white text, if your game is largely set in dark caves, that's going to be okay. But if you have one snow level, it's going to be a huge problem. I promise you there is text there, you just probably can't read it. One solution to this is letterboxing, which is putting a background behind your text. Doing this makes this white text readable even against a snowy city. So, letterboxing. It avoids situations where if the environment is the wrong colour, it can result in really low contrast between your text and your backgrounds. And with letterboxing, it is generally good practice to let players have some control over what colour the box is and also the text. If the box is just a solid block of black, then it might be too obtrusive for some players. And there are specific disabilities where very high contrast can actually cause issues too, like astigmatism, which is an eye condition that causes eyes to refract light incorrectly, resulting in very heavy blurring and sometimes even pain if looking at really high contrast text. As a general rule, letting players dictate their own experiences is best when it comes to accessibility. One thing to note about contrast ratios is that they're an area that is likely to change in the next few years. And this is because game accessibility best practices are they're pretty heavily informed by what's going on in web. And the biggest web accessibility guidelines, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, I'm going to say guidelines a lot in this talk, has a new version in development now. One of the main differences between the current version and this next version, version 3, is an overhaul of contrast calculations. WCAG 3's proposed contrast calculation takes into account stuff like whether a colour is in the background or in the text, which does matter, and stuff like the weight of the font, like if it's bold or if it's very thin. These are things that affect readability in light of contrast, but the current algorithm to calculate contrast does not take these into account. Now, the new version of WCAG is still likely years away, and the current contrast ratio calculation is still a very good tool to determine how readable your text is in light of contrast. So, to summarise colour contrast, aim to have a contrast ratio between the foreground and background colours of your text of at least 4.5 to 1. You can check the contrast ratio on one of many free calculators online. In cases like gameplay when you might not know what colour text will be on, look into letterboxing, which is putting a background behind your text. And contrast ratio calculation also involves brightness rather than colour, which will help you avoid issues surrounding colour blindness. So after fixing the color contrast on this text, I would call this text now technically readable. There are words here, you can make them out with enough effort. It's still quite hard to read though for a bunch of reasons. For one thing, the font is ornate enough that it requires effort to make anything out. I don't have dyslexia, but even I need to actually put an effort to read this. And if I'm needing to put effort into reading this, just think about how bad it is for someone that does have a disability like that. So let's talk about fonts. Font choice is an issue that, as I mentioned, particularly affects dyslexic people, but it can also affect anybody that is having difficulties reading text, whether that be because they have low vision or are trying to read text on a small screen from far away. Font choice, though, goes a long way into communicating the tone of your game, but some fonts are harder to read than others, so it is good to provide options, one that matches your art style and one that is easier to read. So what should you look for in a font that is easier to read? The main thing is to use a sans serif font. Serifs are those little decorative lines that you see protrude from letters in some fonts. The red things you can see on the CF here, those are serifs. These can obscure the shape of a letter and make it harder to tell at a glance what a letter is, which is a big issue, especially for dyslexic people. Sans serif fonts, for those of you that don't speak French, are ones that do not have these serifs. Some examples of sans serif fonts that are free and easy to use include Lexend, Helvetica, Arial, and Comic Sans. And yes, I'm serious about Comic Sans. It is an easy font to read, even if most graphic designers will crucify you for saying that. Aside from not having serifs, what are the characteristics of a good font? One thing you're going to want to look into is kerning, which is the amount of distance between letters in a typeface. The letters should be close enough for them to be clearly part of the same word, yet far enough apart so that they are clearly distinct. And there are some letter combinations in particular that can cause issues with bad kerning, like lowercase r and n, which can look like an M. And here are a couple of other examples here. You also want to make sure that letters and numbers look distinct from one another. There are some letters and numbers that look similar to other letters and numbers. They just have a line going through them, or have a line shooting off them, or they might have a gap somewhere, or look like another letter, except flipped or rotated. There are a few letters that come to mind with that in particular. But yeah, just check that letters and numbers look different enough to help minimize the risk of somebody mistaking a letter for another letter. Here are some good combinations to check to make sure that all these look sufficiently distinct. And there are fonts that are designed with dyslexic people in mind. Examples include Dyslexie, which is a commercial font, and Open Dyslexic, which is open source. Now, you can include these in your game, but they are best provided as an alternative to a basic sans serif font. And this is because some dyslexic people or others who have a harder time reading text may prefer the sans serif font over these. So, as font plays a big role in helping set the tone and style of your game, it is possible that a sans serif font will not play nicely with your game. In fact, in some cases, it will just outright clash with your art style. However, there are players out there that are willing to take a sacrifice in aesthetics in order to be able to actually read your text. So including it as an option is still a good thing to do anyway. Here is a game called Loop Hero. It primarily uses a pixel art font that complements its pixel art UI, but it also includes options for a sans serif font and a dyslexic-friendly font. Now, does the clean sans serif font look good against a pixel art UI? It doesn't, but it means that some players are going to have a much easier time reading the text in this game than they otherwise would. So it's still good to include as an option anyway. So for fonts, include a basic sans serif font such as Helvetica or Lexend as an option in your game along with your font that matches your art styles. There are fonts that are designed to be more readable by dyslexic people such as Open Dyslexic, but if you're going to include those, include them in addition to a basic sans serif font, as some players who do need to use alternative fonts prefer the sans serif font over the dyslexia-friendly fonts. And Using fonts like these might not look good in your game, but there are players that are going to take the readability over how pretty it looks. So having now addressed the font, this is looking a lot better. However, there's still a lot of little formatting issues here that are making this harder to read than it needs to be. This is a big condensed block of text, and the thought of reading it is making my eyes glaze over. So let's look at how we can format this to make this easier to read. We can make this much more legible with just a few simple formatting and presentation changes. So let's go do that now. For cases, it is easiest to read text that is in sentence case. This is what you will generally be writing in anyway, but this is the easiest case to read. Sometimes games will have text in them that is all uppercase to indicate yelling, etc. And it conveys that, but it is harder to read than sentence case because capital letters, there isn't as much variability in the shapes of letters. They are all blocky, the same kind of size, and there's still largely straight lines. So it is a lot harder to tell and to distinguish individual letters. So if you're going to do that, it is good to have an option to make the text sentence case, even if it would otherwise be all caps. Line spacing is the vertical distance between each line and some text, and you're going to want to use line spacing of at least 1.5, which means there is a gap between each line that is at least half the font size of your text. This helps make each line clearly separate, so it is easier to read the text without accidentally swapping lines partway through and getting lost. Try to limit the number of characters in each line, as if your lines are too long, they can affect readability. Long lines are more fatiguing to read for your eyes because you need to move them more in order to scan through and read all of the text. And it can also feel overwhelming to read in large paragraphs, which is especially an issue for some people that have cognitive disabilities like autism. The Game Accessibility Guidelines recommends aiming for 70 characters as a maximum per line. And for text alignment, if you're writing in English, you're going to want to left align your text. If you're going to want to do that if you're writing in any language that reads from left to right. And the reason behind this is so you know exactly where horizontally the next line starts and you don't need to find the next line. If you're instead writing in a language like Arabic, which reads from right to left though, you're going to want to right align your text instead. So to summarize how you should format your text to make it more accessible, have your text in sentence case, set your line spacing to at least 1.5, limit the amount of lines in each line, limit the amount of characters in each line to 70, and left align your text if you're writing in a language that reads from left to right. One more thing that I want to talk about with how text is presented is movement of both the text itself and around the text. And while I haven't included this in my little quest dialogue demonstration, this is another issue that can make text harder to read for disabled players. Let's start with moving the text itself. This usually takes the form of letters and numbers wobbling around to show a character's excitement or anger. It is something that I generally see in wholesome games, and it's easy to understand why. It is very cute and whimsical. It's just also harder to read. I have also seen in my consulting work text bubbles that move around as a character walks, and unfortunately this kind of movement can make text much harder to read, especially for dyslexic players who are having to take things a letter at a time. And if the text moves away sufficiently, then they can lose their place. For players with ADHD, movement might be distracting enough that they don't read text before it vanishes. And a wobbly kind of text can be a problem for lower vision players, as it can and a wobbly kind of movement is also a problem for lower vision players, as it can make already blurry text even blurrier. So avoid moving text around the screen if you can, and if you do have text that vibrates, let players turn that off. Here's a screenshot of some vibrating text from a game called Freedom Planet 2. It's a screenshot rather than a GIF, partially because I didn't have time to figure out how to create GIFs, but also to make a point. If you look at the letters here, they're all off center and the kerning is off, so it's not clear what that's just part of what word. So if you're including this kind of vibration, letting players turn that off can make it easier to read for a variety of players with a variety of disabilities. Let's also talk about movement that is happening around the text, something like animations in the text box that is holding the text, or lots of particles and all that flying around the screen while text is being displayed. This can make text harder to read for players with ADHD or for similar reasons to text moving. The movement can be distracting enough that players miss reading the text. And it can also be an issue for autistic players who might get overwhelmed trying to read the text while lots of other stuff is happening on screen. So try to avoid a lot of movement happening in your dialogue boxes or let players turn it off. And if your game is heavy on particles and all that, consider letting players turn those down. Both of these moves will help prevent players from being distracted by movement while trying to read your text. Here are the dialogue boxes in a game called Little Gator Game. And now, it has these paw patterns, as you can see, and those move diagonally. It's subtle, but it can be distracting while you're trying to read text. And while there isn't much text there, it is something that I wish I could turn off. So to summarize movement, avoid moving text boxes away from their point of origin, as it can make text much harder to read, especially for dyslexic people. Let players turn off vibrating emphasis text, avoid movement within text boxes or let players turn that off, and let players turn down background visual effects and particles so they can make text easier to read. So, having cleaned up the formatting of this quest dialogue, it is now in a form that I would call readable. So, what is the quest that our hypothetical player is being asked to do? And time's up. Was that not enough time? Oh, too bad, we're moving on. Let's talk about time limits. Time limits to read text can cause issues for disabled players for a large number of reasons. For one thing, some people take longer to read text because they have a lower reading ability than other people. This is more common than you would expect. On the more severe end of things, according to the Game Accessibility Guidelines, 14% of adults in America and the UK have a reading age of under 11. And on the less severe end of things, while I haven't been able to find any contemporary New Zealand studies, I have found studies like one from the Ministry of Social Development, which suggests that in 2006, I'm going back quite a bit, only around 55% of adults have the literacy skills expected of someone leaving secondary school. Now, this is a topic that carries a lot of stigma, but people having lower reading ability is more common than you would expect, and these people are playing your games. Time limits are also an issue for people who have conditions like ADHD, where they might be distracted by other things, so they might not have time to read your text before it vanishes. There are players with dyslexia who will have a harder time passing your text. There are players with lower vision who have a hard time physically seeing the text. And then there are just those of us with pets and small children who might be distracted while our pets and small children get up to mischief and we miss out on reading text. We cannot make assumptions about how long someone is going to need to read text because there will be players that will take longer than we give them. And there are several things that we can do to mitigate this. Now, the ideal thing to do would be to just give the player the control of when text advances. If the player presses a button for dialogue, etc. to continue, then they are able to take as long as they need to read text. If they need to look up a word or have someone explain what someone's saying to them, then by giving players control of when text advances, they have all the time in the world to do this, and they can do all this without any issue. You can also let players revisit earlier text. One neat thing that the newer Fire Emblem games do is that the game logs dialogue that characters have spoken, and you can go into that log and scroll up if you've missed something. And something else that you can do is have plot summaries. So, a bit of text that summarizes what has happened in the game up to this point. And this is useful in cases where, after a long cutscene, someone realizes that they're completely lost. Another way that you can mitigate time limits on text is to have someone read it out. Some people might have difficulties reading, but can listen to text just fine, unless they also have a hearing disability. Players with low vision or dyslexia will have little issue understanding your text if they're able to hear it. One good thing to do in accessibility in general is to convey information through multiple channels, like showing something through colour as well as symbol, that kind of thing. This is an example of that. Conveying the information that you are trying to convey both visually and orally can help mitigate issues from time limits. Now, I am very aware that voice acting is very expensive. It is really nice to have voice acting in your game, but if you're an indie with a really tight budget, that just might not be possible. At the same time though, if you have dialogue and can have someone read it out, it can make it much easier to understand for some people. An alternative approach is text-to-speech software. Some games like The Last of Us have the option to use text-to-speech for menu text, which can help players who might struggle to read the text understand it quickly. If you're going to use this for dialogue though, it's best to make it explicit that this is for accessibility, because for reasons that are pretty understandable, using text-to-speech for dialogue tends to not go over very well. So if you're going to do that, just make it explicit that this is for accessibility, we can't afford voice acting, and it's better than not having anything. So to summarise how to handle time limits, the best thing to do is to just not use time limits for text. If players have control over when text advances, then this issue goes away entirely. If that's not possible though, letting players revisit information conveyed during those time limits, while also conveying the information through other means like sound, will also help mitigate issues stemming from time limits. Next, I'm going to talk about a very closely related issue, subtitles and captions. Now, this is a very, very big topic that could easily be its own hour-long talk, so I'm mostly going to summarise the major points. I'm not going to have a cheat sheet slide at the end of this section because the next few slides are essentially subtitle cheat sheets. So if you're taking photos of those, then do so for all of the following slides. Subtitles are a text equivalent of spoken dialogue. The main difference between them and captions is that captions also include important sound effects. So if someone fires a gun at somebody, the bang of that gun would be included in captions. Now, subtitles need to be bigger and clearer in presentation than most text for multiple reasons. For one thing, subtitles are temporary. They are only on screen for a short amount of time as dialogue is spoken. The primary audience of subtitles, deaf people, generally don't have English as a first language. Now, this might not sound super intuitive unless you think about it, but sign languages like NZSL, ASL, and all that, they're not English. They're not English as expressed through hands. They are separate languages with their own grammar and structure. And people who primarily speak through NZSL might not be as proficient in reading English as most other people. And also, subtitles need to be read while there's action happening on screen. So there's also that degree of multitasking that makes clear presentation very important. So let's talk about presentation for subtitles. I mentioned earlier that text should be at least 28px at 1080p, and you should be able to scale up to double that. For subtitles, the scaling up part of that is a lot less optional. Subtitles need to be set to at least 46px at 1080p. This doesn't need to be the default size, but you should be able to support that size as a minimum. Your subtitles should also support letterboxing, as players need to read it quickly, so any issues with low contrast are going to be a serious issue. You're going to need to be strict with how many characters you show on screen. At any given moment, you should not have more than 2 or 3 lines of subtitles on screen, and each line should not be more than 40 characters. And subtitles should have really clear formatting. They should have a sans serif font and be in sentence case. Subtitles should be in the bottom and middle of the screen. This is where they're conventionally placed, but given the functional nature of subtitles, we probably shouldn't mess with convention on that. And subtitles should be well clear of other UI elements so that it's clear where they are and they're easily seeable. Here are just a few quick pieces of good practice when it comes to subtitles. Now, first of all, Let players turn them on before they are needed, or have them enabled by default. Some games will, on first startup, launch straight into the opening cutscene, and if subtitles are off, then deaf people playing your game will need to watch that opening cutscene twice. The first time not understanding anything that's happening, and the second time with subtitles on so they can know what's going on. And I can assure you, if they have to do that, they're probably not going to be in the best of mood with your game. Next, give players at least 2 to 2.5 seconds to read a line of subtitles. If you're making a kids game, it's going to need to be longer. I would look at 4 to 5 seconds for that. And also try to avoid spoiling things in subtitles. If someone's cracking a joke, then the punchline should be in a different subtitle. If something happens to somebody as they're speaking, that should probably be in a separate subtitle too. Like, I should not know someone's going to get shot mid-conversation before the shot happens. Now, one option that's really good to provide along with subtitles is speaker names. And given that one of the biggest purposes of subtitles is allowing deaf players to follow along with conversations that they can't hear, you can't expect them to know who's talking based on the sound of the speaker's voice. And while lip flapping and context can help, they're also not a surefire way of conveying who is talking. One thing that is commonly done to address this is to show speaker names. Now, if you do this, it is best to make sure that there is a high contrast between speaker name and speakers. They are often color-coded, but you're going to want to make sure that color is high contrast. So if your subtitles have a black letterbox, then you're going to want to pick a bright color. And you should also let players turn off speaker names. Some people prefer subtitles without them, but yeah, they are definitely a good thing to include in your subtitles. Another thing that you can do with subtitles is that if dialogue, etc. is coming from off screen, you can put an arrow at the start of the subtitle to show the direction the sound is coming from. Those of us who can hear can determine direction from sound. If someone's speaking to the left of me, I can hear that they're speaking to the left of me. People who are reading dialogue through subtitles do not have that context. So displaying an arrow is a good alternative way to convey what direction the sound is coming from. Now, this little screenshot here is from The Last of Us 2. Let's take a broader look at that because this game just has really good subtitles in general. They are large with letterboxing and a little outline around each letter, which helps them stand out from the background regardless of what's happening there. The lines are not too long. Speaker name is a good color. If I were nitpicking, I would probably move the where at the end of the first line to the second line, as that would make the lines more similar length and make each different part of that sentence into its own line. But otherwise, this is an excellent example of subtitles. So this pretty much covers the basics of subtitles. Again, this is a really massive topic, and there is a lot of nuance to really good subtitles. There are a lot of good write-ups and videos out there, so search for them if you want to learn more. I would in particular look for best practices for subtitles in film, because that's a medium that has them figured out, and games on the whole are not quite there yet. Still though, if you follow the tips that I just outlined, you will have among the better subtitles in video games. Let's have another look at that quest dialogue. Now, I can't give you all day to read this, I have 10 minutes left, but let's have a slightly longer look at this and see if you can tell me what the player is being asked to do. It's still a bit hard, isn't it? The text itself is readable. We are just now dealing with issues with the content itself. The language here is needlessly convoluted and can be simplified. This is also a really rambly paragraph that talks about multiple different things woven in one another, so it's hard to find information that's actually useful. So let's look at fixing both those things. Now, as I mentioned earlier, there are plenty of adults out there who have a low reading ability. If text is too complicated, then a lot of players are going to have difficulties reading it. Writing in simple, plain language is another huge topic that I could easily talk about for multiple hours. But here are a few tips for writing simpler sentences. First of all, avoid jargon and long words if you don't need to use them. This is obvious, but it really is one of the simplest things that you can do to make your text more understandable. If you do need to use a piece of jargon, then, well, because you're talking about something very specific, then it's good to explain what that means in as simple language as you can manage. This isn't me saying don't use long words, but if you do, make sure to take the time to explain what those words mean. Avoid run-on sentences. If your sentences are too long, or they discuss too many ideas at once, they are harder to understand. If you're writing it in plain language, avoid sentences that are over 15 to 20 words long. Try to stick to one idea a sentence. If you do all of this, it will result in text that is a lot simpler. Write your text in active voice. In an active voice, someone or something is performing an action on a subject, whereas in passive voice, an action is being performed on a subject. Active voice results in sentences that are clearer, shorter, and more direct. For example, if I were describing myself eating a sandwich, in a passive voice, I would say a sandwich is being eaten by me. In an active voice, though, I would say I am eating a sandwich. The active voice example is shorter and much more direct. On a similar note, a good way to write simpler text is to avoid nominalizations. These are when you use words that are not nouns, so verbs and adjectives, as a noun. For example, if I were to say that I went for a walk, walk is a nominalization because I'm using walk, which is a verb, as a noun. You see that? I used a piece of jargon and I explained what it meant. So, yeah, that's an example of how you can do that. The reason to avoid nominalizations, though, is that they usually result in longer sentences than just using the actual verb or adjective. If I were to say that I went for a walk to the supermarket, I am using walk as a normalization. But if I were to just use walk as a verb, though, I could just say I walked to the supermarket. By swapping to using the actual verb, I cut that sentence's length to almost half, just through doing that alone. Now, simplifying dialogue can be a controversial topic. The word choices that characters make are often a big part of what gives them character, and it might not be possible to simplify their dialogue without stripping out that context. And that context often goes a long way to making characters feel real. When I think about my favourite characters in video games, I can talk about how word choice contributes to that. Like Vivi from Final Fantasy IX would be no way near as effective as a character if he spoke in academic text. Now, perhaps there's a narrative reason why the person in my quest dialogue is speaking like that. There isn't, it's just to prove a point, but there might have been a reason for that. Even if a character speaks in a complicated way, though, there are things that we can do to help audiences out, such as letting players mouse over particularly complex language for an explanation of what that means, or having summaries after dialogue or in quest descriptions, which are in more simple language. There is an old Russian video game called Pathologic that is infamous in part for its dialogue. It is deliberately obtuse, extremely folksy in tone, and really difficult to understand. And this is a deliberate choice by the developers of that game. The reason that this is done is to help build a sense of being an outsider, and helps build a sense of unease in a horror game where characters lie to you and you don't necessarily know what is happening. Now, while I understand why the dialogue is written like this, and it does go a long way towards the tone of this game, it is also a choice that means that a large number of players will find this game just unplayable. So keep that in mind when writing complicated dialogue. For system text, though, please use simple language for that. Players need to know how to interact with your game. If a player can't quit a game because the text is so complicated that they don't know how, then their long playtime is not because they're having fun. If you have a good reason for not having simple text in your UI, though, then it's good to let players opt out of that. There is a game that released this year called Thank Goodness You're Here. It is an extremely British game. It's more British than drinking tea while watching Love Actually. And because of this, there are language options in this game such as English and English. Now, I love this. As soon as I first saw this, I was just like, already on the floor cackling. But unless you were born in Britain or have consumed enough British sitcoms, you're probably not going to know what most of this means. Thankfully, developers let you opt out of this when first starting up the game, and just showing simple continue options and quit text there. So to summarize writing text in simple English, avoid jargon where possible and explain it if it has to be used. Avoid run-on sentences, use active voice, and avoid nominalizations. Use tools like glossaries and logs and quest descriptions to help summarize conversations in more simple language. And if you have overly complicated language in your system text, let players opt out of that and swap to a more simple language. Now, this is a complicated topic, and it is something that you can take as far as you like. For an extreme example, look into what Easy Read is, which is a type of document that is intended to be read by people with severe intellectual disabilities. And it is a really good way to learn how to simplify the language that you're using, and is just a really interesting thing to look into in general. Next, I'm going to talk about paragraph structure. It is much easier to understand text if you use shorter paragraphs and try to group your text by topic. Look at the quest dialogue that I wrote again. Here are the sections that are relevant to what the quest actually is. Now, flavor text, it's good, not criticizing that. However, because it's interspersed in this very big paragraph, it makes it harder to pull the important parts of this paragraph out. So, when writing text, if you want it to be easily readable, then split into smaller paragraphs and try to group ideas together. The guidelines don't have a maximum, but if a paragraph is longer than, say, 6 sentences, then there's probably room for simplification there. If all of the important information was put into the same paragraph without flavor text, this would be much easier to read. Now, this is great for players that have a lower reading age, players who are autistic and might be overwhelmed by big paragraphs. Players with ADHD, they might look at a big paragraph and just say to themselves, no, I'm not reading that. Another thing that you can do with very wordy paragraphs with a lot of flavor text is that you can highlight important words, which will help players pluck out important information easily. In this case, from The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom, this quest log highlights an important detail for completing the side quest. So let's apply those changes to the quest dialogue that I wrote. Let's simplify the language structure, and let's simplify the language and better structure it. Here it is. So, what was the quest that players were being asked to do? They were being asked to fetch some large red fruit for a dinner party. This concludes my talk. Hopefully you found it interesting and I didn't cover too much, but I will be around for questions afterwards if you have anything you want to ask me. So, yeah.